There's still people connecting, but I think maybe we should get going, and other people will join as we speak. So welcome to this conversation, which is part of the Global Decenter series on decolonizing decoloniality. The Global Decenter started in 2015, and you can have more information on the website about the center. Its members are looking at ways to enact decentering, and they're academics, artists, curators, all sorts of different people from as many parts of the world as possible so far. And we started this series with Peggy Levitt, who is here, also Sandrine, who I saw, and other members, to discuss this metaphor of decolonizing, or this term decolonizing, that's used in many different contexts, in many different ways. And so we've had already a number of conversations, probably about 5 or 6, which you can find the topics and some of them also the recordings online on our website. And today, after having many conversations with my colleague Masha Serovic, who is here for many years, about how the term decolonizing is used in the context of Eastern Europe, as far as this category is useful, but I think maybe you're gonna discuss that. We had found the impulse, and this space was great to host a conversation, a more in-depth conversation about this, and also to have other people joining and feeding this conversation. So I'm letting the floor to Masha, who is the host for this one conversation. Thanks to Masha, and thanks to our guests today, and to you all for joining us.
Thank you very much, Nora, and thank you, Peggy, for and the rest of the Global Decenter for inviting us to host this debate, which is part of a very lively discussion, or several lively discussions within our field, broadly seen Eastern European, North Caucasian, etc. Several discussions because because it's not always that easy to bring them together, and so I'm especially thankful, grateful to to both my colleagues who have almost immediately accepted my invitation to this discussion and the challenge of discussing all those issues among us and with people from all over the world and from different fields. I thank you so much for this opportunity, Nora and Peggy. So I'll be hosting just the discussion, and I'll just briefly introduce our 2 participants today. So Ketevan Butchani is a professor of anthropology at Ilia State University in Tbilisi, Georgia. She has an international education, but has been working in Tbilisi for a while. She has specialized in anthropology through postdoctoral work in the UK and the USA, and looks at practices of everyday religion, as well as urban anthropology and informal resistant practices, which are very much current, or a very current topic in Georgia today, as Georgia is going through a major political crisis directly linked to Russian aggression against the country. And then we'll have also Olena Palko, who is a historian of Eastern Europe, a historian of the Soviet Union with a main field of Soviet Ukraine, looking at minority history and nationality policies within this frame, and really showing us how changing our scope, changing our archives and our fields are really changing. Are really making it possible to completely transform our idea or our understanding of what seemed to be settled and very classical question. She actually studied in Kyiv itself, and has then had an international career. with a lot of exciting publications, mostly in English. And after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, she has been vocal and involved in the debates, both political and scientific, that have shaped our field since then. She has also, among others, been a very outspoken critic of the Western or Russian Western colonial view of Ukraine in dominant historiography. So I'll just give you the floor right away with maybe an introductory or a large introductory question to Olena and Ketevan about the ways that that intellectual debates about coloniality and decolonization are shaped in your respective spaces. Olena, do you want to start, or?
Yes, I can go ahead. Can you hear me well? Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation. It is a challenge, especially when we go out of this intellectual bubble that you are in, and you understand that kind of perhaps your thoughts or ideas are shared. So I will try to explain my position, but then I hope that there will be also a discussion and debate that we can perhaps to explain more things later on. So yes, this is a very good topic, and in a way, obviously, we've been discussing decolonization framework and decolonization debate very intensively since 2022. This is something that perhaps in the West has come to the forefront, but in a way, this debate is not new for Ukraine. And on the one hand, we can talk about kind of historicization of this anti-imperial or decolonial thought in Ukraine as early as the 1900s. And if there is any interest about this, I can perhaps later elaborate on this process of how Ukrainian intellectuals, but mostly Ukrainian Marxists, how they understood this kind of dichotomy between being part of this Marxist liberating or emancipating discourse, but also trying to fight against the Russian or the Bolshevik, the Soviet centralization. But if we kind of go to more recent history, then also this post-colonial approach has been widely introduced, mostly in literary studies since 1991. And it comes through Ukrainian scholars, but those who were working in Western institutions. In particularly, it comes kind of through Australia, via kind of scholars who worked in Australia, then bringing it to Ukraine. And it's been quite well developed, but again, in literary studies, less so in history. And in history, somehow it starts being more discussed and incorporated since 2014. And 2014, this is the year of the Orange Revolution. The Euromaidan Orange Revolution was early in 2004, but generally, kind of because of this general popular upheavals in Ukraine, it always kind of brings in this intensification of the debate about Ukrainian past, Ukrainian present, and identity. But generally, the war that started in 2014, it raised this question about what kind of war Ukraine is fighting. And very interestingly, like Tim Snyder, the historian, Yale historian who is now moved to Toronto, he already in 2014, he said that Ukraine is fighting a colonial war. And it was quite radical because between 2014 and 2022, the events in Ukraine were generally discussed as a Ukrainian crisis. So this is also kind of telling. It wasn't like a civil war, it was not a Ukrainian crisis, but he called it as a colonial war. And it initiated this very active discussion in Ukraine, but also outside of Ukraine, what kind of relationship Ukraine had vis-a-vis Moscow, but also vis-a-vis other Soviet republics. I greatly appreciate this format that we can also talk with Ketevan about the experiences in Georgia, because I think everyone would agree, those coming from this context, that different republics or different imperial peripheries had very different experience during the imperial or the Soviet rule. Hence, there might be a lot of misunderstanding of how we see our history, or even like kind of representatives of Ukrainian academia see it very differently. So what I'm gonna say today, this is generally my view only, and perhaps should not be generalized, and I'm happy to discuss this too. So as far as a historian of Ukraine, my position, perhaps it's also a little bit provocative. In this context, I don't really think that this decolonization, this course, as a theoretical framework and not necessarily as a practice, and I hope we will talk also about the practice of doing history. I don't think it is very helpful to understand complex and tangled Soviet past in Ukraine as a historian of Soviet Ukraine. And I can perhaps explain very shortly why. So I think there is firstly, I believe, this kind of epistemic opposition from the West, or those to whom we are trying to bring this conversation to. Russia is not commonly perceived as an empire. Hence, those experiences of different republics or kind of peripheries or republics within under Russian imperial or Soviet rule, they are not necessarily considered as colonies. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, there is this also shared imperial legacy in Western Europe, and also perhaps a huge influence from Russian immigrant community historically, not just currently, but historically, that shaped some kind of this often normalizing view of Russia. I think kind of the events and the media presence or coverage of all those cruelties since 2024 or 2022 helped somehow shape a little bit or shake this often normalizing view of Russia and its actions. But so as a result, I kind of feel that by pushing too much into this decolonial discourse, we might be also fighting the windmills, and kind of others might not necessarily take us seriously. But at the same time, so this is on the one hand, on the perception side, but from the Ukrainian side, I also think that the relationship between Ukraine and Moscow, or kind of Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Russia, or generally the Soviet Union, they were highly complex and tangled. And this was not just the situation, or kind of this relationship of domination and subjugation, but also of collaboration, working together, or kind of German very good word, Mitarbeit. And so I just don't know if kind of working together is the same as Mitarbeit, but it kind of feels that we are working together towards something, and not just good, but also bad. And this is also something that becomes particularly useful when I teach Soviet history, not just saying they and us, but by looking at different events in Ukrainian history, as for instance, the famine in 1932-33, to show, like, to speak about the perpetrators. And then we kind of also see how many local perpetrators were involved in bringing this or institutionalizing or kind of implementing this famine. And this is not to negate the negative kind of Soviet policies. I don't want to justify them, but this is just to show how complex the situation or the history was in Ukraine in this period. Yes, and this is what brings this kind of complexity of the past, has also been discussed by Ukrainian historians. So, for instance, a historian, Yaroslav Hrytsak, who I believe is quite famous as well in the West, he, in his polemic with Tim Snyder, he actually mentioned that Ukraine is more than a colony. He spoke about this as a Ukraine as a Sonderkolonie, like a special colony. And so he explained it in a way that Ukraine has always been part of the imperial core, but at the same time, the center of anti-imperial resistance. And this kind of brings us back to this historicization of the colonial thought or decolonial thought in Ukraine. And usually Marxism was used as a tool of both colonization and anti-colonial struggle in Ukraine. So kind of to bring it perhaps kind of to the end, this my introductory note. I wonder whether this kind of, as I said, this decolonial framework, but also this idea of making Ukraine as an exception, as a Sonderweg, whether it's useful and perhaps we just need completely a new vocabulary. And there have been a few attempts to try to go beyond this post-colonial or decolonial and trying to explain Ukrainian experience in kind of a more dialogical form rather than the opposition. And I could just very briefly name a few examples. For instance, the Swiss Slavist Ulrich Schmid, he looked or kind of proposed an approach of transnational contact zones by kind of showing how this was not just, again, the process of kind of coming from Russia to Ukraine, but it has always been hybrid. There's been collaboration, mediation, transcultural exchange, and this is how is also this bilingualism comes into question. But most recently, there is a very new book by Svetlana Bedareva about ambicoloniality of war. And so like she also uses this term ambicoloniality to go beyond this decolonial or post-colonial methodology to show that there was this process of twofold exchange and interaction between, say, Ukraine and Russia in these terms. And this is a very kind of interesting concept that can help us perhaps to show the connection rather than a necessary kind of relationship of domination. So yeah, generally, this would be perhaps my question, whether we should try to use and find a new vocabulary for the relationship, for a situation of Ukraine within the imperial and Soviet Union. And I'm very happy to actually hear whether whether Katavan thinks it could be useful or not, but also perhaps from the audience. But generally, yes, this what is going on in Ukraine. There is this struggle to get Ukraine's own agency and voice, so to be heard, and whether we should try to fit in the frameworks that are already there, or in kind of, and perhaps again, as I said, like kind of this fight in the windmills, whether we can win against the very well-established tradition of decolonial thought, or whether we could actually, as Svetlana Bedareva does, whether we could perhaps introduce new models, new vocabulary to explain this entangled relationship within those bigger entities. Thank you, and I'm happy to elaborate later on points raised.
Okay, Tevan, for
so,
different, but maybe not so different view.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for the invitation and for the great introduction, and for Olena for many great topics that you raised. I will maybe start to talk more about the differences in the imperial experience within first the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union or the Soviet Empire. I think the differences are important also to understand how and to what extent what kind of terminology is useful, or if it matters at all to this extent what kind of terminology we use, and to also show how in the starting from the 19th century these kind of discussions were there. Maybe they used different words, but in certain times they use the same imagery, the same metaphors, and this could give you interesting perspective or vignettes for us to talk and to think about. And I will shortly introduce the Georgian case. So Georgia lost its independence in 1801. When after a treaty, the Russian Empire decided to abolish the Georgian kingdom. So the imposition of the Russian rule went together with the abolishing of Georgian kingdom and also introducing Russian language as the sole language of bureaucracy. That was this kind of linguistic imperialism that was felt very closely because Georgian language is a totally different language. And now me stressing this is also part of this anti-colonial discourse because it is not even an Indo-European language. So it will be understandable for you how hard it has been for the population to have all the state issues done in a language that was completely foreign for them. And it was a way of controlling people by controlling their means of communication and also self-definition. And that was not just administrative convenience, but a deliberate strategy of cultural transformation. And with it goes, and these are things that I studied, the redesigning of city spaces, of gardens, of streets to Russian imperial standards, of what was proper. And this redesigning and turning the spaces into proper spaces was kind of colonization of physical space and the built environment. To give you an example from this period, this is part of my ongoing research. For example, the Russians, they would come and build a new district in Tbilisi, and they would give names to the streets that would remind the population about the wars they lost, but the Russians won against them. For they would pick a big street and give it the name of the Gunip Street, and Gunip was the place where the Caucasus was defeated. So defeated from the perspective of the population, but won and victory from the perspective of the empire. So that was one example how the empire invaded also the everyday lives of people. And it of course served this control purposes, but also the symbolic functions. Who could read the signs and who could run for the elections, etc., was everything together. But together with this came also the idea, this captivity of the rule and of the governance went together with the discourse of gift. And Bruce Grant, in his book, The Captive and the Gift, shows very well how this, everything was a complex gift relationship in which the Russian imperial rule would frame everything as gift. So we gave you culture, we gave you opera, we gave you theater, etc. And then came the anti-rhetoric from the Georgian intelligentsia that relied mostly on linearity and oldness and very old ties with Greek antiquity as European ties. So the rhetoric would be, we have always been here, and we had the high culture, so we had script, we have older Christianity, we have older churches, we have older literature, etc. Until now, this kind of oldness is something that is very important for Georgian history. So this is something that unites people. And just to give you a small picture from the 19th century, there is a British traveler, and he discovers that there are so many places that remind him of Argonauts, because the Argonauts with Jason came to Colchis to have this gold and the knowledge about how the gold is produced. And then he sees on a picture that there is a Georgian king Tamar from the 12th century, and on the Argo, instead of Jason, but with the same robe, etc., is the Grand Duke of Russia. So though there was no sea to cross for the Russians, they pictured themselves as the new Jasons or the new Greeks who come through sea to conquer the Caucasus. So these discussions always about is it a colony, if there was no sea, etc., was not a problem for the Russian imagination in the 19th century. Later on, there is a different kind of colonization in which the gift relationships are renegotiated in the Soviet period. In the Soviet period, Georgians, and this is discussed widely in books like in Claire Kaiser's Soviet and Georgian. This could be a good reference, or Eric Scott's book Familiar Strangers, who shows that it is not only we can look at different republics in the Soviet Union, not from the center to periphery, but also from the peripheries, how important different groups were for the entire Soviet Union, but still it has been perceived in Georgia somehow is kind of exceptional separation of being not on the equal terms to different republics and to Russia. That was the Stalin factor produced this kind of exceptionality in the beginning, because there was a situation in which Georgia experienced both the special attention and particular forms of control because of Stalin's origins. And this created kind of ambivalent positions where Georgians could simultaneously claim privileged status within the Soviet hierarchy while experiencing also colonial domination. There were examples from everyday fights. There were, I can give you more examples if we have time. I think I spoke too much, right? We can wrap up there. There are a lot of everyday forms of resistance, but we can come back to it to talk more about this entanglement of different forms of domination.
Thank you very much. Before we move to this question of everyday practices, which I wanted to keep for the end, I just wanted you to maybe come back to the political uses of decolonization by various actors, both yesterday, but mostly today, and how those various actors, in your cases, might include the states themselves. Who wants to start?
I could also start, Orlena, if you agree, and then the floor will be yours. So, in case of Georgia, the state was actively trying to decolonize, starting with the Rose Revolution, when the Soviet past was declared as the criminal past, and as kind of the narrative of invasion was the prevalent narrative, and the narrative of occupation, because Georgia was independent from 1918 to 21 when the Bolshevik invasion happened and Georgia lost its independence. It took also a form of legislative decolonization when the Soviet symbolics was forbidden in public spaces. Though it did not happen to the, in practice, it was very hard to do. There were certain buildings that were attacked, but other buildings that were very much negotiable, and what part of the city history prevailed, and what kind of practices were criminalized and what not, shows you also very interesting picture. It was, for example, in case of Tbilisi, the imperial past of certain city parts was kind of muted, and the parts that were picked as the lifestyle, the Georgian or the true Tbilisian lifestyle, it prevailed to more extent. Or the figure of Stalin, though it was forbidden, it was very hard to tear the monuments down, and they pop up quite often. And there is this fight against this figure as the colonial figure, despite his ethnicity, or the criminal figure of the Soviet past, while others still have this national pride in him. And there are from different actors, not only from the state, but in academia, these are scholars who try to look at Soviet past and at imperial past from different perspectives. To give you an example from my research, it would be, for example, what kind of epistemic culture was here, and despite the regulations that existed on the Soviet level, what kind of knowledge was produced here that was not only colonial, what were the responses and what were also success stories. I will cut it short. Now, Lena, it's you.
Thank you, Lena.
Thank you. Yeah, it's actually very interesting because now we already see the difference in treatment of the Soviet past, at least in the 90s. I think Ukraine is in a way is different here because the independence of Ukraine in 1991 was in a way achieved through the actions of so-called sovereign communists. Because our first president, Leonid Kravchuk, used to be the head, so one of very important party functionaries. And there were attempts of national opposition in the late 80s. And they were also looking at the Baltic scenario in a way of kind of how to replace this communist party, but perhaps there were just not enough people, or their appeal was just not accepted throughout Ukraine, because Ukraine has also, we haven't discussed this, but Ukraine has very different histories, right? Like Ukraine used to be part of different empires, and we are talking here about Ukraine, Russia, but at the same time, Ukraine in different parts of history has been part at least of 3 empires. This is also Austria-Hungary, this is also the Ottoman Empire, but also when we think about the interwar period, this is a nationalizing Polish state. So there are a lot, I mean, there are a lot of this dependency relationship that we can discuss and how we deal with them. But generally, this is this connection between Ukraine and Russia is the one, obviously, because of the war that is now being problematized. But what I wanted to say that in the 90s, because our former communists and party functionaries became this new elite in the independent Ukraine. So in the 90s, there's hardly been kind of an attempt to reject the Soviet past. And I can see that Yulia Yurchuk is in the audience, so she's the best person to actually talk about this. But there were attempts to kind of bring this national history and combine it with what was already there. And perhaps the best example is how in Ukraine, we dealt with the Second World War, the memory of the Second World War. So this idea of the Second World War as the great patriotic war, this Soviet narrative remained until early 2000, because I remember there is this big museum of the Second World War in Ukraine. And I remember exactly the point when they actually changed the name. And why I remember this is an anecdote. I remember the bus stop, and this was the last stop of the bus. It has always been Museum of the Great Patriotic War, and then it changed to Museum of the Second World War. So this was it's only started happening in the 2000s, and especially in 2000, after 2014. So 2004, the Orange Revolution that I've mentioned, with Viktor Yushchenko, he started to kind of trying to fight against this acceptance of the Soviet past, and he introduced new kind of this collective memory was based around this the Holodomor, the famine that arguably was shared across Ukraine. So there was something easier for people to relate to as a common trauma. And then after 2015, this is when really in Ukraine, kind of this process of critically dealing with the Soviet past started. And the state was an important actor here, like from good and bad. There in 2015, there were these decommunization laws introduced. On the one hand, this is what also affected this practice of decommunization or decolonization. All the state archives were opened, and this is something perhaps also contrary to other post-Soviet republics, where access to state archives remains either closed or controlled. In Ukraine, you can really access everything freely. So this was good, but at the same time, this law criminalized propaganda of the Soviet past and equaled it to the Nazi past. So it complicated the narratives about the Soviet history as well. And most recently, in 2023, there was a new law, which kind of shortly is being called the decolonization law, but it really, the name of the law includes this need to decolonize place names. And so this wave of first decommunization after 2015, when city names, street names, monuments started to be replaced. And in 2023, with this new law on decolonization of place names, it even expanded, because those streets that remained after 2015, they are now being discussed and also changed. But important actor in this regard is also the public, so there are examples when the intellectuals or citizens of particular cities kind of oppose this carpet renaming of streets and place names. And perhaps a good example is Odessa. In Odessa, so some monuments and some streets, again, like where exchanged those of the Soviet past, linked to the Soviet past, or the Soviet functionaries and Secret Service officers. But generally, this is like streets or monuments to Catherine II or Alexander Pushkin. They remained, and now there is this debate of very rapid renaming, but also removing those monuments. Some have been already removed, and there's been a letter signed by a lot of public intellectuals to UNESCO, because the city center of Odessa is the UNESCO heritage site, saying they are not against renaming, but they are just saying that perhaps we should wait until after the war, when we can have a proper public discussion on the heritage, on the identity, on what should be removed and what not. So this is just to say that there is kind of the state as the actor that does not, so, and the view of the public, of the intellectual elite, they are not always in line. And perhaps indeed it's the bad time to kind of start those debates at the moment because of the ongoing war. But there is also, it also shows that there is this public demand to discuss more about the past and perhaps kind of problematize the past.
Masha, can I add just a small comment? I think it also there are so many differences despite being under one Soviet Union. For example, in Georgia, this entanglement was not as strong linguistically also, because we always spoke as a state language, we spoke Georgian during the Soviet Union too. So this linguistic independence was very important and still is. And so I was born and raised in Soviet Union. So, and I never perceived myself as Soviet citizen. That was something that I heard for the first time when I went to Germany to study. Then I thought with shock, oh, they think I'm Russian. How can I be Russian? My Russian is not good enough, etc. Or when they saw us, or now when the Russian migration came because of the war, and our Russian was not good enough. It was a shock because this perceived unity was not perceived by us. So this is just a small comment.
I think this kind of, we are already starting to go into the broader discussion. Maybe just a few words to conclude, maybe both on this question, maybe also on how it's all been maybe reconfigured, but also more tense due to the larger effects of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So not just in the Ukrainian national political space, but beyond. What you're saying about all those people coming, being interested in those new spaces, or saying that they are interested in those new spaces, be it Ukraine, be it Georgia, and the kind of questions, maybe very shortly as opening remarks for broader discussions. If you want to tell us something about how you see maybe decolonization as practice in this new context, if one of you wants to go.
Olena, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I can try to be very brief, and then yeah, I think this kind of decolonization as practice is very important, and especially as a historian, the question for me is how do we write and tell history about Ukraine, but also about the Soviet Union. And I think there have been there were discussions about 1991 as a archival revolution, because although Soviet's archive were open, but generally for a very long time, and kind of with some notable and good exceptions, but people would still go to Moscow, St. Petersburg to study the history of the empire and the Soviet Union. And I think now with 2022, and I've followed the debates, especially in the UK, among the scholars and historians, how they are lamenting that how can they do their research, if they can't go to Moscow. And it's interesting that often for many, there are no ethical issues, but there are just institutional limitations. So they would still go there, despite what is going on, just because, they are used to working in those archives. But there are obviously also a lot of other examples with very famous scholars who embraced those regional peripheral archives as central to ask those central questions. And I think, so one of them is the historian Hiroaki Kuramiya, who wrote a lot about the Soviet Union. He uses Ukraine perhaps sometimes as a case study, but he is a scholar of the Soviet Union. Nobody would call him a historian of Ukraine. But actually, he said that some of his brightest, kind of not brightest, but biggest arguments or his biggest finds he found in local Republican archives, telling the story and the history of the empire. So I think the most important practice, this decolonizing practice, when we think about how we do history, is try to reverse the lens and try to understand how knowing the peripheries can tell us more, not just about the peripheries, but also the center. So to enhance this perspective on general events by integrating these local archives and making those local archives into central archives. But obviously there is this question of languages, and Ketevan, you are right. It's because our language is perhaps, our Ukrainian language is perhaps easier to master for those speaking already Russian. And but at the same time, I also heard a lot, why do we need even to learn Ukrainian? We can go to Ukrainian archives because documents are in Russian. And I think this is what makes Ukraine an interesting case. And it might be the same in other republics, because I don't know this archival context. But you cannot tell the history of Ukraine with only one part, like one language. You really need to know both Russian and Ukrainian, and sometimes, depending on the story you want to tell, also another language, whether it's the history of the huge Jewish community and the Jewish heritage. Obviously, you need another language to that. But sources are really in different languages. And if you only have this glasses through the Russian language, you will be just retelling the story of the center just found in the regional archive. So this is this praxis that perhaps very briefly I could highlight.
I will also build on this. The thing will be what are your language knowledge? What can you read? And we have anthropologists like Florian Mühlfried or Paul Manning, Kevin Tuit, who for many years picked the Georgian archives, newspapers, etc., and explored from this kind of peripheral perspective, all the rest. But then there is another thing. The archives, mostly the imperial archives, keep things for you to read. They do not keep everything. So I made it as my aim to look into rebel archives. Rebel archives are things that the state did not want you to read, but people kept it. So these are. I have a trove. It's a wooden box. It is filled with things that is my grandmother kept from the state, but she preserved it. So I will write this kind of anti-history of everyday resistance, what you wanted us to read whenever we would discover it. So, and there are many things that could allow us this kind of rebel reading. I will wrap up here and to give some time for discussions, right? Good.
Thank you very much. I'll just open the floor for the discussion. I would have a lot of comments and questions, but I assume Yulia Yochuk, you want to open. Thank you, Yulia, for joining us.
Thank you very much. It was fantastic. And I was so fast to raise my hand because I have to leave you in 10 minutes because I am a discussant in another conference, but I really wanted to be with you because I think this is fascinating when we always think about these differences, similarities, what is so special about Ukraine or Georgia, why it's not in this, paradigm of decolonial studies or post-colonial studies. But I think that each case is in a way very unique, and when you speak with people in even South America, they would say, oh, our case is so unique. And I don't think that we should be all striving to say that we are not unique, that we have so many similarities, and that is why we can use this theory, because I think that the theory is only an instrument, and I think that you all can agree with this. And about the practices, this is very interesting because these practices, like I was writing a lot about history writing, right? And I was using this paradigm of post-colonial studies, and I was saying that this is what we are seeing, actually, this is reclamation of history, right? And this is pretty much into this line of decolonial, post-colonial writers, thinkers. But actually, like, nobody even use this word, like reclaiming history. And now I see that it's now Katerina Botanova comes with the book, and it's called Reclaiming History, Decolonial, like decolonial thoughts on Ukraine, something like this. So I think this is fascinating. And also what is very interesting, how the state kind of interprets this kind of decolonization, which very often is not at all how we read the theories, right? But what is interesting, how this grassroots practices are different from the state. And they are actually, I think, this is fascinating just to observe how, like, people are, and I'm a very big fan of podcasts, different podcasts, and this is fascinating how many podcasts we have now, how many YouTube channels we have now, where people just meet to discuss history, and what they discuss, it's very much decolonization. They discuss how they discover their family history, how they discover that actually my grandmother was Ukrainian speaker and I never knew this. And this is something I think what is fascinating, and for me, like, this is not so interesting what this state kind of comes with these laws, because these laws are not really about decoloniality. But when you see what people are doing with this, it's really, I see as very like decolonial moves and gestures and everything. And just Ketevan, just to a bit about this. Kind of a Russian Empire trying to show that it's colonization because this imagination of the sea. And I have a colleague here, Alexander Polyanichev. I think that many of you know him, and he actually shows how the Romanov Empire created tropics in the Caucasus just to claim this coloniality, that it's like real colonization. They are colonizers. So I will stop here and thank you very much. When I disappear, just know that I have to.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your comments. Nora, do you want to move to discussion of non-specialists?
I'll try to ask a question that was asked actually at the last conversation by Federico Besserer. He asked, in your context, are people making a difference between post-colonial and decolonial? Is this part of the conversation, or is it just, post-colonial, decolonial in one go? And the next question that I have, sorry, but I'll be short, is connected, is how do these decolonizing initiatives, if the term is used, how are they combined? Is there also talk of the practices of the Ukrainian or Georgian state with minorities, or with also maybe colonizing certain regions or spaces that are, still part of the territory?
Excuse me, could you, Nora, repeat the second question? I couldn't hear.
So there's a discourse that's we need to decolonize from Russia, from the Soviet space, from the Russian imperial space. But is there a discussion that is, oh, maybe there are minorities or indigenous communities in our own country?
No, thank you very much. I can start, Olena, if you want. So in case of decolonization, post-colonialism, not that the state uses it, but it is most part of the academic discourse. And in terms of they speak about post-colonial attitudes when we do this kind of self-orientalization, when we feel shame for the ways we do certain things, and then it is framed as something post-colonial. Decolonial is something that you will hear a lot in the protests. For example, the pro-Western protesters right now, we have the ongoing protests since 28th of November every day, and they say they frame Russian influence as ongoing colonialism and position the alignment with the EU as decolonial liberation. At the same time, government supporters sometimes employ this anti-colonial rhetoric against Western institutions, characterizing EU and NATO integration as a new form of colonization. And the third level would be your second question, that ethnic minority communities sometimes view Georgian nationality itself as potentially colonial. And that was a topic also in the 90s when this topic emerged about this kind of nested minorities, as Krista Goff also explores, that as Russians behave towards Georgians, Georgians behave the same way towards their own minorities. They created their own they behaved like imperium. This is my answer.
I can perhaps very quickly answer so we get more questions. So yeah, this, as Julia said, indeed, there are a lot of kind of these discussions on different platforms, and they all operate with decolonial. So this is decolonization. Post-colonial is more theoretical as well. So they are the best that we kind of post-colonial nation, and kind of we are in the process of decolonizing. But the question of minorities is a very good one. And I also could see in the audience Elmira Muratova, who is a Crimean Tatar scholar. And so, I mean, Ukraine is a very diverse country, and like we have Russians, we have Russian speakers, but the big question is obviously about the Crimean Tatars, especially those who left Crimea after 2014. And again, Elmira could tell us more about this. But there is a lot of now attempts to rediscover Crimea and rediscover the Crimean Tatars and incorporate them in this kind of Ukrainian identity. But yeah, the problem with minorities is that there's always this question of Russians. And there's always been kind of complicated, like ever since the 1920s, whether Russians were a minority or not. There are studies that show that a lot of Russian speakers, so that language does not necessarily mean identity. A lot of Russian speakers and even those ethnic Russians, they say that they are now Ukrainian, increasingly so since 2022. So there are different stories about this kind of inter-community relations in Ukraine.
But just like Yulia Yurchuk, for example, did mention Alexander Polyanichev, who is one of the scholars who also looks at the role of Ukrainians as agents of colonization in the Russian Empire. But I'll just skip to the next question, and I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the names. So Kuro Peña-Diaz?
Yeah, that's fine. It's okay. Thank you. So please, I'm in a noisy place, so if you can hear my question, please interrupt me and I'll write it in the chat. So I'm Kuro Peña and I'm LGBT activist and researcher. So my question is a little bit related to that, because over the last decade, we've seen how Russian authorities have used repeatedly a quote-unquote an anti-colonial rhetoric to justify measures and policies aimed at countering so-called LGBT propaganda as part of a broader strategy to safeguard national sovereignty and by protecting traditional values from so-called European values or Western values. So this rhetoric has been used, among other discourses, to justify the invasion of Ukraine, sometimes, for instance, by some authorities, like the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, saying that the invasion was aimed at stopping pride parades, and other, even Vladimir Putin has also engaged in that. So, and also at the same time, there is a reflection of this rhetoric in the justifications of the Georgian Dream government of the law on family values or the law on foreign agents. So I would like to know what the speakers think about this use of quote-unquote decolonial language or decolonial language to, and more broadly on this discourse on the clash between traditional values and European values, both to justify occupation and imperialism or a democratic backslidance. Thank you.
I will give you a short answer. Thank you very much for this question. So the pro-Russian rhetoric keeps this idea of delinking from the Soviet and Russian values as demise, whereas the protesters, etc., they say we do not align. So you are not the container of good values, etc. And what is that we strive is this openness, etc. But it is very much used in the rhetoric. You are completely right, and they want to create this kind of or recreate the unity. And Georgians increasingly see, or they saw also this migration, the Russian migration to Georgia at the beginning, especially as this danger of this kind of invasion. As who are they coming? And it was a very complex issue. Yeah. Olena, maybe you. I don't know how many minutes we have, but yeah.
Yes, this indeed in kind of this anti-colonial rhetoric is being misused or abused in the Russian war. And we kind of also see how Russia presents Ukraine as anti-Russia, as kind of full of those Western values. And this is all Western kind of influence and things like this. And I think this is a big problem of kind of this new meaning, giving new meaning to concepts, and then using these very vast channels of propaganda to, channel those views also to the wider audience, and especially when we think about so-called global South. And this is where Ukraine is really also kind of needs to perhaps do more, how to perhaps sort of not necessarily debunk, but to offer something else to this Russian propaganda, and how the war in Ukraine is being presented, that it's not necessarily, that that this is not between the West and Russia, and obviously for many countries in the, with their own experiences, the West is the evil one, so they are siding with, the party that we are fighting against. So I think it's a very difficult conversation, really, and yeah, it's kind of the use of those terms that take it away from kind of Ukrainian, the legitimacy of Ukrainian understanding of the war and what they are fighting for, in a way.
I think we can afford to take a couple of minutes more and just take the last questions. I'll take both of them. So Alka Kumar and then Olivier Ferrando, just together, if you could make it short, and we'll see if Olena and Ketevan can answer a bit. Your microphone.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to ask my question. Very interesting and insightful talks and conversation. So I must confess, with my positionality in Canada at this point, I am not very familiar with the local context. So that all of you are talking about, although it's very interesting to learn more about it. But my question, I want to kind of take it, to a bigger level, where I was very interested in learning more about ambicoloniality when you talked about going beyond decolonial. So ambicoloniality, anti-history. So some of these, theoretical conceptualizations, where how do they help us disrupt the power imbalances that exist on the ground, and how can they help us do that? Because in the case both of minorities and many other marginalized groups, there are inherent imbalances and inequities when it comes to distribution of power. So does a model like decoloniality or decentering or ambicoloniality in practice, how does it actually, in terms of practice and action, how can it help us disrupt those power imbalances? Thank you.
I jump on it, right?
Yeah, I'm sure that Olena and Ketevan will have a lot to say to Alka's question, but so we'll take yours before giving them the word.
Okay, thank you. I just joined the network, so I'm really new, and I'm a political scientist specializing in Central Asian studies. So my question is related to the previous one on minorities and indigenous people's experience of this decolonization, because Central Asia, for instance, was colonized in a very classical way. And from the second part of the 19th century, and then the Soviet regime is perceived as a continuation of this colonial power. But the question here is that it is not perceived as a Russian colonial power, but a Slavic colonial power, a European colonial power coming into Central Asia, where Ukrainians are part of it. So the perception of Ukrainians in Central Asia is that they were part of this colonial power. So my question is more for Olena, is how do you position yourself in this kind of multi-layer coloniality, where you might be feeling as a colonized land, but also part of a colonial power when moving into a region and a lot of
people settling into Central Asia. There was 1 million of Ukrainians in Kazakhstan, for instance, in 1991, just coming during this period. So just this question that is quite tricky for Central Asia. Thank you.
Should I perhaps quickly answer? Yes, indeed, and this is what kind of makes this this model or this kind of approach to call Ukraine a colony so difficult, because Ukrainians as part of, I don't know, this kind of bigger Russian nation has been seen as, you know, one of those colonizers in Central Asia. But at the same time, this 1 million of Ukrainians that you talk about, obviously, a lot of them were also settlers, but many of them were also there because they were deported, or, you know, they kind of Ukrainians, ethnic, but also people from Ukraine, because Kazakhstan and Central Asia were also used as those kind of the prison for a lot of people sent out from Ukraine. So there are kind of all these different, you know, dimensions to this. But this is why I think this simple model of they did this to us doesn't work. And if we talk the previous question about ambicoloniality, this approach that kind of emphasizes this mutual impact and intertwined colonial histories perhaps can be just more productive by saying that Ukrainians have been part of the core, have been part of this history, but at the same time, it doesn't negate, you know, the power dynamic between Moscow and Ukraine. And that's why kind of it's so complex, right, to understand. And kind of perhaps, but I think there is also a public demand for these complex histories rather than just negating. I've been working last semester with Ukrainian students, and all of them are asking, so what do we do with Ukrainian Soviet art? You know, like we cannot just refuse it. And like some good examples of Soviet Ukrainian literature, not just, you know, the social realism that is very kind of standard novels, but they all ask this question. And these students, they were born already in, I don't know, 2000s. Yeah, so they don't know the Soviet past, but they have this understanding that we can't just give it away. And also practices, there were a lot of artistic exhibitions also during, you know, since the invasion, 2022, also bringing in those Soviet Ukrainian artists, and they were like sold out exhibitions. There is a public demand to reclaim, as Julia said, this history. So not just to give it away, but to reclaim and kind of perhaps, you know, appropriate it as well, with all the problems that there were, like with, you know, with the fact that Ukrainians were also among the colonizers, Ukrainians were also among, you know, the perpetrators, and so on and so on. So this is perhaps, if I don't know if this answer this question about power imbalances, this is more perhaps this epistemic power imbalances. Yeah, but we don't have much time. So Katavan, if you want to add something.
I think you covered both questions in perfect way, but I would just add for the in the case of anti-history, I think that this concept of anti-history, that when you challenge the dominant historical narratives, can sometimes also create new blind spots or address others. For instance, in the Georgian historiography, there were sometimes attempts, or in the narratives as well, to stress the Georgian part of the history instead of the Soviet past and Soviet historiography, simultaneously marginalizing the minority experiences within Georgia itself. But then there was another trend that introduced also the history of minorities as part of the Georgian history, what they did for the Georgia as well. I also agree with Olena about difficult past of the buildings, and there is this attempt to see them through different lenses, though it is a very hard and ongoing process of negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our guests have been very much more reserved than they sometimes are in more private spaces about the realities of power imbalances in both their countries and our fields. But I just wanted to thank you for your generosity in hosting us and give the floor back to our hosts. So Peggy and Nora, thank you very much again for hosting this discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in. Thank you to everyone for coming today. This was really great. I appreciate Nora and Masha for organizing, and Elena and Ketaven for really teaching us a lot. For some of us, a not very familiar part of the world. So thank you for a lot of things to think about. I want to just give a heads up for our next and last session for this year. It will be given by Elham Shahsavarli, who is a PhD candidate in social anthropology at York University. She's from Iran originally, and the title of her presentation will be Parallel Academia in Iran, Resistance or Reproduction of the Center. We're not yet sure about the date, but will be either the last week of April or the beginning of May, and it will be moderated generously by Anaí Aliso Moreno, who's an independent scholar. She's been based in France, but now she's living in Germany. So please look out for those. And if you want to get on the mailing list of the larger Global D Center, I'm going to put my my email in the chat, and you can write to me, and I will put you on the list, and we would be very glad to have you. So thank you again. I guess Nora, I'll give the last word to you.
No, just thank you, everyone. I learned a lot. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much again for this.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
You can stay on for a minute if you